Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm VA Winter. I am an indie author and I'm not sure anymore entirely what I am. This is the first in a series of videos about the witch and her representation in media, literature, kind of culture. First one, which is this one, is called The Historical Witch in The Once and Future Witches and the Burnings. Once and Future Witches is by Alex E. Harrow and The Burnings is by Naomi Kelsey. What we're talking about is the figure of the witch, the representation of the witch and how she's changed over time. Obviously, the witch is a historical figure and she has persisted through time, through literature, though she's changed quite a lot actually along the way. So there's a book called Witch Face of Witch, Self-Representations of Women as Witches in the Works of Contemporary British Women Writers by Adriana Mardej Stang. She says that witch trials and by extension witches are subject to constant revisions and reinterpretations. The image of the witch that we see in, for example, Shakespeare's Macbeth is vastly different from the representations that we now see in contemporary literature and media across genres. So talking about historical fiction, fantasy witches, everything in between. The three witches in Macbeth are really interesting and something that I'm probably going to talk about in more depth in a different context, but they are in some senses ambiguous figures, so they're viewed in the play as forces of evil. There's an article called Witch Hunt, Persecution of the Other in Representations of Witches and Witchcraft in British and US American Literature, and that's by someone called Jacqueline Schaeffler. I'm not 100% sure how you say that, but she says that Elizabethan audiences would undoubtedly have viewed the witches as holding ultimate responsibility for Macbeth's evil deeds through their temptation, because that was the context at the time. The witches were a force of evil. However, the witch since then, since that play in the 1600s, the witch has constantly been rewritten. She turned into a little bit of a comic figure not long after Macbeth, actually. Again, Adriana Mardej Stang sort of discusses this in her book in relation to a play called The Late Lancashire Witches, and that's by Richard Brome and Thomas Haywood. And then obviously today we've got the witch as the representation of a feminist woman, a queer woman as marginalised figure. Then you've got sort of historical fiction that's been written in the contemporary period, which explores the figure of the historical witch as she might have been then in reality, not as the sort of cartoon version that we've created her into, that we think of her as in the past, the Halloween witch. So this essay, as I say, split into 4 parts. It looks at how witches have been rewritten to suit our contemporary view of her and how she's become what we need her to be in our current society, from her representation as a historical figure to her gendered female persona, her connection to queerness, and finally to how she is used to represent those from lower social classes. My argument is that the witch represents those who don't conform to societal expectations, and as societal expectations have changed, so has the witch. She is an enduring figure, and I think she will continue to adapt and change as society does and as we do. So the process of rewriting the witch for our contemporary period, I would argue, kind of began with her adoption as a feminist icon, and Adriana Mardej Stang describes how that happened in the late 1960s. A group of American feminists created the first witch, and that's WITCH, an acronym. It stands for Women's International Conspiracy from Hell, which I just think is really cool. So they selected the future of the witch, referring to the idea that witch trials were acts of violence undertaken by the patriarchal system against strong and independent women. The witch as a social outcast could subvert the patriarchal society with her hexes, that is, actions questioning and challenging the existing social and political system. The witch became thus a symbol of the feminist movement. Since then, the witch has been rewritten in literature and media, changing her from the fairy tale Wicked Witch, who, as Jacqueline Schaeffler says, often played the antagonist to child heroes, representing evil parents, mostly mothers, and untrustworthy adults in general, to either an empowered woman or a misunderstood figure, partially, I think, dependent on the genre that contemporary writers are writing. So these figures can be seen in the 2 novels that I'm looking at in this part of the essay, which is The Burnings by Naomi Kelsey and The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. Both of these novels are historical fiction, but they're set in different time periods and they do look at the witch from different angles. So Kelsey's novel, The Burnings, is set during the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland and deals with the historical witches she might have been. There's an intimation in the novel that the witches do have real powers, but the reader could also choose to believe that the events the witches attempt to manipulate are coincidences, such as the storms that strand King James abroad with his new bride. The novel juxtaposes a character called Agnes Sampson, who is an older midwife figure with a character called Galis Duncan, and she's younger and she wants to learn the healing arts from Agnes, basically. And Agnes is portrayed as at least wanting to be a witch, thinking she's a witch, and buying into the idea that she has these sort of satanic powers and wanting to cause harm to the king and his plans. Whereas Galis is the sort of innocent one in it all. She just gets dragged into the plans and schemes. She has a lot of hesitancy about her in the novel. And coming back to Adriana Marder-Stang again, whose book is really, really good. If you're interested in the history of witches in literature, it's a really good book. But she refers to, there's a historian called Diana Purkis, whose book I haven't read. Marder-Stang references Diana Purkis in her book, and she says that there was an existing interest in magic and its uses in daily life by people at that time. Possibly, kind of the hypothesis is, as Adriana Marder-Stang goes on to say, that might have been their only apparent means of resistance. Kelsey, I think, therefore, is trying to write the witch as she could have been in history through the figure of Agnes. If the novel is read as Agnes having actual supernatural powers and causing the harms that King James I accuses her of, then Agnes is guilty as charged. But others who were accused were innocent and simply guilty of not conforming to societal expectations. And that figure, the innocent figure, is represented by Galis Duncan in the novel. And in that way, Kelsey kind of attempts to ground the historical witch in reality, showing the horror of the accusations, the torture that was visited upon the accused women, and the shades of light and dark that might well have existed in that period. Whereas The Once and Future Witches deals with witches of a different type. The novel is set in 1893, and that's during the time when the suffragists were active and campaigning for the female vote. Harrow equates those two things through her three sort of main female sisters who are all witches, and one of them does get involved in the movement for the female vote. And they are real witches in this novel. It blends fantasy and history to create a different world that is very similar to ours. And that's playing into the growing legend of what Adriana Marder-Stang calls the Burning Times, which mythologizes the witch hunts, turning persons murdered then into martyrs. And by turning the witches that were burned and hung during the historic witch trials into martyrs, that myth, which is used by more authors than just Alex E. Harrow, has the effect of downplaying the horrors that those women, and there were some men as well who were executed, the horrors that they were subjected to, and erasing the real lives that were ruined simply because of an extreme form of misogyny and religious belief that was allowed to proliferate at the time. The witches in Harrow's world do face an antagonist named Gideon Hill, who is revealed at the end to have a connection to the witchfinders of the past, adding to this sense of the historical witch as real witch, just as the main characters in the novel are. And this witch is the feminist icon. By equating witches with the suffragette movement, the suffragist movement, Alex E. Harrow plays into this idea, this mythology of the witch as empowered woman. There's another article called The Witch Archetype and Gender Dynamics, a case study of Alex E. Harrow's The Once and Future Witches, and that's by, and I am going to butcher this name, Berta Puig Freixens. But she says, the difference between a woman and a witch is that the latter is empowered in The Once and Future Witches. If witchcraft is a metaphor for women's rights, witches are women with power. And so in this kind of dynamic, we see the difference between these two contemporary novels rewriting the witch. One is attempting to look at the historic witch through a realistic lens, as realistic as we can get without going back in time anyway, and the other writing the witch as a metaphor for an empowered woman. Though the witch in our contemporary literary period can be portrayed as either historical witch or the feminist icon witch, or indeed a blend of the two, in both cases she is the other. So as Jacqueline Schaeffler says, as the witch transitioned from written format to visual media, her otherness maintained a focused aspect of her character. Her difference often a pointed purpose to her character's development and the story in which she is featured. And though that's discussing the witch's transition from page to screen, especially in the US, I think it applies as the witch moves through literary time as well. And the other, in this context, is a character who lives on the margins of society, who is excluded from mainstream society. We other a group in order to establish the characteristics that make up that group are not like us. We are human, they are not. Because of certain characteristics or traits or cultural norms, we can then use this to justify mistreatment, discrimination, that kind of thing. So think of the debate around immigrants, for instance, that's currently happening certainly in the UK and in the US as well. So looking at the figure of the witch, I think it's possible to see how she has been used to represent the other in literature. And I use air quotes because there is no other. It's a construct. She's been used to represent that other in literature and culture. And in the books I'm going to be looking at through this kind of series of essays, the witch represents the other as far as gender is concerned, as well as sexuality, and of course my personal favourite topic, which is social class. The witch as woman, as lesbian, as working class, poor, oppressed, is, as Adriana Mardej Stang describes, the enemy, which society needs to focus its patriarchal aggression on. The witch as a figure has always represented the woman as no longer useful. She was, as Neslihan Yilmaz Demirkaya says in her article, Scapegoating Non-Conforming Identities, Witchcraft Hysteria in Arthur Miller's The Crucible and Carol Churchill's Vinegar Tom. And she's quoting another writer called Janelle Reinelt. I need to get better at saying these names. It was poor women, unmarried women, and old women who were used as scapegoats via accusations of witchcraft. She was likely poor, living on the margins of society, perhaps needing support from her neighbours due to age or disability. In a lot of ways, she still represents this figure in contemporary period, but she has also expanded her role as literature has begun to recognise the lesbian to represent her too. The witch has evolved and changed over time as society and culture has evolved and changed over time. We no longer, at least en masse, believe in Satan or the real magical powers witches might possess. We are, for the most part, a more rational society than the heavily religious, pre-scientific world of the 17th century. I do want to acknowledge that witch hunts and murders do still take place in some parts of the world, but these are thankfully in the minority. Witches in the 21st century are seen, for the most part, as a representation of the power of women, and in literature are used in a metaphorical way to discuss the issues of being othered by society. As Adriana Mardej Stang says, as time passes, stories change and develop to encompass the changing reality. And it is this changing reality that I'm interested in these essays. How do we see the witch now? How is she used to represent the other? And what are these representations saying about the world we now live in?